The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. An interesting new study published in the journal PNAS earlier this week says that if you are a guy with an older brother, you are statistically more likely to be gay. Scientists have been studying this pattern for a while, and now they think that there's actually a biological explanation as to why, and that it starts even before birth. And the importance of this is that if the findings can be replicated, we would at least be able to point to one biological reason for homosexuality, which is something that has been the subject of a lot of debate, particularly between the science and religious communities, and between the science and homophobic communities, and between the science and anti-gay marriage communities, basically between science and every community that wants to see discrimination against gay people on the basis that they choose to be gay, that there is not a biological basis for homosexuality. Now, I've been clear before, Pat, if you'll allow me for a moment here, I've been clear that even if people chose to be gay, it still wouldn't be okay to discriminate against them, but it would still be relevant to discuss whether there is a biological basis. And this gets us one step closer to realizing that there is.
Yes, and of course, there are choices that we can make that we also can't be discriminated against for, like your religion, and in most cases, veteran status is a choice as well.
Certainly.
And pregnancy status is usually a choice as well.
If there's no draft, of course, when we talk about Vietnam vets, it's a different story, but if there's no draft, then status as a veteran is absolutely something that one chooses. So back to our story today. There are a lot of different factors that determine someone's sexual orientation as far as science knows now, but the idea here is, can we identify some specific ones? And there's this phenomenon related to a protein linked to the Y chromosome. Women do not have a Y chromosome. That's very important to brain development, and that it's possible that when a woman becomes pregnant with her first boy, the Y-linked protein gets into her bloodstream. The mother's body recognizes the protein as foreign, again, because women don't have a Y chromosome. The immune system responds, creating antibodies, and if enough of these antibodies build up in the woman's body and she gets pregnant with another boy, they can cross the placental barrier, enter the brain of the second male fetus, and alter brain function in a way that might make that second boy or subsequent boy more likely predisposed, so to speak, to be gay rather than heterosexual. They're still trying to replicate this, but it is very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's been suspected for a long time, and we never really were able to point to a specific reason.
That's right.
One that I heard, and this was many years ago, was that the mother just didn't have as much testosterone after giving birth to a few male children.
Oh, that's interesting.
Just as a theory, I don't know how true that would be.
Yeah, I have no idea. I've not read anything about that one. Do you actually think, though, that if we find a biological basis for homosexuality super specifically, that there will be less homophobia? I just think the homophobes will find other ways to be homophobic.
I think it's something that's going to, disappear eventually, and, we'll have to go through the generations, and there'll be fewer and fewer homophobes out there. Same thing happened with racism and sexism, although we're not in the clear, obviously, with those two, but we're obviously better off than we were.
We've not closed the loop on those yet either, I would say. Yeah, I've mentioned before, my 13-year-old sister, she only recently learned that there is such a thing as homophobia, because she grew up where there were classmates with two moms and there were classmates with two dads, and it's never until she started understanding media and politics, she had no idea that it would even be a controversial thing. Like, if when she was 7, you said, there are lots of people who think it's wrong to have two dads, she would have said, why? That doesn't make any sense, because homophobia is learned. There's nothing natural about homophobia.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, in other parts of the country, by the time they become your sister's age,
they're completely homophobic.
or maybe they didn't know that there was such a thing as gay people, right?
Right.
So it happens both.
It happens both ways. That's for damn sure. We've talked before about discrimination against people who suffer from albinism. Albinism, of course, is the condition where you basically lack pigment in both hair and skin. And this is something that we've covered in Africa, where there are actually all sorts of superstitions in Africa around albinism, and the idea that people who are albino may carry everything from evil spirits to be cursed. I mean, it's crazy, the stuff that goes on around albinism. And you now are seeing the United Nations urging Fiji not to ignore the ostracizing and discrimination against albino people, because it's pretty bad there. And growing up, I knew a couple of albino people. Like there were always a couple in my school or in high school, and it was never really a big deal. It was just like, oh, they seem really blonde, and they have very, very blonde eyelashes, eyebrows, and they burn very easily, and obviously hair. But it never even occurred to me that it's something that's seen almost like as a supernatural evil in different parts of the world. But it's a major, major problem how people suffering from albinism are persecuted.
Yeah, and I mean, even just the rates across the world. I was looking into this, and I guess in sub-Saharan Africa, the odds of becoming albino are just 1 in 15,000, whereas in Fiji, where the story focuses on, it's only 1 in 700. You know?
So it's much more likely. In other words, way more albino people in Fiji. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know that much about what causes this. We know that it's people that have little or no melanin, which is what colors your eyes, hair, skin. And the biggest problem is not if you're not being ostracized for the way you look, which you are in some countries. Yeah. The biggest problem is susceptibility to skin cancer, because you are really susceptible to the sun's impact on your skin.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about people who have fair skin, oftentimes they're up in the Arctic, in the Nordic regions, right? Maybe people from Ireland, for example. But
you're
it's
in
not
Africa,
hot there.
exactly.
If you're in the tropics or if you're in Africa,
and you're albino,
it's a lot more dangerous.
You're in absolutely very, very rough shape. So yeah, continued issue, the persecution of the albino people in Fiji having a major, major problem there. And by the way, to be clear, the problem is not that they have more albino people. I had a sense that my grammar may have been ambiguous. The problem Fiji is having is persecution of albino people.
So it's scientific education that we have to promote in order to solve this problem, I would imagine?
I don't know. I mean, if you believe that there is something spiritually wrong with an albino person, would someone reciting some scientific explanation about lack of melanin?
I feel like that's how it happens, right? I mean, there's a slow transition of people learning more about how the world actually works.
Yeah.
And then you don't need a placeholder like religion or spirituality to give you those reasons, right?
Try going into a Pentecostal or evangelical church and talking about science and seeing how far you get.
Yeah. Back to the first story, it's all about a transition. Right?
Yeah, not a guaranteed win. But yeah, no, I do understand what you're saying. Spirit Airlines. Have you ever flown on Spirit?
I have. Very cheap.
Oh, you have flown on it. Was it as horrible as I've read it is?
It was completely normal.
It was?
Yeah. I'm not very rowdy, though.
Okay. Spirit is known for being basically the worst airline in the United States, way worse than the low-cost carriers Southwest and JetBlue, which actually are really pretty good. I think that they're some of the better carriers in terms of room and coach anyway. Spirit is known for having the least legroom of any airline domestically. And they are not particularly known for customer service. And there's now a story that's going viral about a woman who was flying with her parents and her young son. And she says that Spirit Airlines kicked the entire family off the plane when she was breastfeeding her 2-year-old, who was very restless after a very long flight delay. She was told to stop. She didn't immediately stop, and she was kicked off. Okay? She is a concert pianist, a cancer researcher. She asked for a few minutes to allow her son to fall asleep in her arms while the plane was still at the gate and other passengers were walking around, and she was breastfeeding and kicked off. And a Spirit spokesperson disputes her account. She says that the woman was failing to follow flight attendant instructions to buckle her son into a seat after the plane's door had been closed. As usual, what is the exact story? We may never know. There is not video of this one. That's where you get into a complicated thing with any airline, which is you are supposed to follow flight crew member instructions at all times. And so is it about the breastfeeding, or is it about the fact that she was not following the direction of the flight crew? I don't know how these seem to become impasses to me, where what are we really going to figure out? Because you're supposed to follow what the flight crew says, but what you were doing was breastfeeding your kid. Where do you go with it?
I mean, sometimes you just have to use human judgment, right? I know there's so much sensitivity around air travel that you feel as if things have to go copacetically, right?
You as the passenger or as the flight crew?
As both. I mean, they have to give the instructions and you have to follow them.
Everybody has their expectations as to how it's supposed to go.
Yeah. I just feel like sometimes human judgment, specific scenarios take over where obviously this is not going to be a risk to the child, to the woman, or anyone else on the plane for another 2 minutes breastfeeding the child, and then he can go to sleep, right? I mean, I think that's not good.
Let me counter that. What if they were about to leave the gate.
But they weren't. I mean, I think the doors had just closed, and then there is a good amount of time where, you stay stationary.
The rules are, once the door is closed, you are considered to you need to be at that point in takeoff secured status.
She broke the rules. I understand that.
Yeah.
But I think you can exonerate her.
I
think
tend to
you
agree
can
with
give
you.
her a pass on that.
I'm sort of playing devil's advocate, but I don't see the major issue. And believe me, I've been on basically every flight I'm on. I wish that something was being done to pacify the screaming children. And the woman was trying to do it. So that's something we should applaud.
Yeah,
right?
she's a hero, really.
Breastfeeding on planes. I don't want to get into this again, but there's a story from a few years ago where I told a story about like a 5-year-old that was being breastfed. And I said, my analysis was this kid was too old to be breastfed 5 times during a 1-hour flight. And they described themselves as lactivists. They went crazy and were demanding my resignation from my own show, which is, of course, crazy. Then they realized I'm not going to get fired from my own show. So then they demanded an apology because there are some communities that believe it's okay to breastfeed up until age 6, 7, or even 8 years old. And that's not the way I was raised. That's not the way I was raised.
I mean, there's cultural difference here, right? I mean, sometimes
These were all
you see
Americans.
up to 3 years old. But
what culture are we
6, 7,
talking
8,
about?
that's crazy.
That's what I thought.
And that's not an excuse for, differences. Not one of these, what are they, like, cultural relativists or
Cultural relativism. Moral relativism. Yeah. Well, both, really. Yeah, so I don't want to open up that can of worms again, but you can find the video clip on YouTube if you want to rehash that drama. I think the title of the YouTube clip, if I recall correctly, is this kid too old to be breastfeeding, or was this kid too old to be breastfeeding? Something along those lines. And it was a bad idea. But you know what? I didn't apologize because I don't believe I said anything wrong.
They couldn't milk an apology out of you.
Clever. Very, very good one. Very, very good one. That is it for the bonus show. We have a full, yes, next week is a full week. And then we go into end of the year vacation mode where we will be off for the week between Christmas and New Year's. And then we'll be back with major, major things, big things in January of 2018.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.